the minutes from the November meeting.
I make a motion we approve the minutes as stated.
I second the motion.
Any discussion? All in favor? Okay, that passes. Is there anybody from the public here to make any comments? Okay, so on the consent agenda, does anybody have any questions or things they'd like to discuss on the consent agenda?
I just want to ask one thing. On the, are you talking about also the environmental mitigation, Dustin? Did you have a chance to look it over, and do you think everything's in line?
Yeah, I'll look it over and I don't have any questions. It just seems like a quarterly update with no additional information from last time, so no, it's fine with me.
Thank you.
All right, did you want to brief us on the update from the Transportation Committee and the Board of Directors?
Yes, happy to do so. Your last meeting was on November 9th, and since then, at the board's November meeting, the board received a quarterly overview of developments in the financial markets, which you also have on your agenda today. The board also approved the EMP Land Management Grant Program with the recommended project awards for grant funding, which you saw on your October meeting agenda. And then at its December meetings, the board approved the Elvira to Marina double track project amendment to accept $62 million in cap and trade funding, and that's on your consent agenda today. And then based on discussions at both the ITAC and the board's November meetings, staff presented an informational report to the board with an update on both the Transnet program and our revenue forecast, and that is also on your agenda today.
Questions? All right, so item number 7 is a proposed amendment to Sandag board policy. This is one where we're asked to give a recommendation.
Good morning. So the Sandag Board Policy 31, the Transnet Ordinance and Expenditure Plan Rules, as attachment 1 in your report, provides administrative requirements for implementing the Transnet Extension Ordinance, including requirements for local agencies to develop a Transnet program of projects, or a POP. Among these requirements is that the local agency must hold a public hearing regarding the proposed list of projects. And this is stated, this is a quick correction, your report states 4.A of the ordinance, actually 5, section 5.8 of the ordinance. So in your report, that section states that each local agency shall manually develop a 5-year list of projects to be funded with revenues made available for local streets and road improvements under section 4D. And a local public hearing on the proposed list of projects shall be held by each local agency prior to submitting its project list to the Commission for approval pursuant to section 6. Sandag Board Policy 31 implements these requirements, and while the ordinance calls for a public hearing regarding the list of projects, the current language in Rule 7 of Sandag Policy 31 calls only for consideration of a POP at a public meeting, as stated in the underlined portion of your report. Staff has taken this opportunity to update the Board Policy 31 and replace the term public meeting with public hearing in Board Policy 31, which the definition will be determined by each local agency. Proposed amendments to Sandag Board Policy number 31 are scheduled for consideration by the Executive Committee on January 13, 2017, and the Board of Directors on January 27, 2017. So the ITAC is asked to recommend that the Executive Committee recommend to the Board of Directors that they approve the proposed changes to Rule 7 of Sandag Board Policy 31 in substantially the same form as attachment 1.
You got that same question I had.
Well, my question was, if there must be some substantive difference in the definition of meeting and hearing in order to necessitate a change, but.
Sure, there's no actual definition, but the main difference is that a public hearing allows for an open of public testimony and the record of that, and then the closing of public testimony, whereas a public meeting does not. So we're kind of opening it up for more public input if we include the board's public hearing versus public meeting.
Out of curiosity, are we a hearing or a meeting?
This would be a meeting.
But we have opportunity for public to speak.
Correct.
Is that just by our own internal rules as a meeting is not a requirement?
Correct.
Well, it was
kind of vote well with it.
Doesn't really matter, but.
Okay, my question is, what has happened that is behind this recommendation change?
Sure, so, one of the cities had showed us the difference that we had required them to actually hold a public hearing to adopt their POP, that they held a public meeting instead, stating that the board policy only stated a public meeting versus a public hearing. So they were following the board policy 31. And that's where the change was brought up.
I have no objections to the change.
I move approval for invite that.
Any other discussion? Okay, I'll put everybody all in favor of the recommendation. Unanimous? Item number,
Oh, the motion. I made the motion.
Thank you.
And who seconded? Carolyn seconded?
No, I was going like this.
Dick second. Okay, so then item number 8, Ariana?
Yes, this is an update on your triennial performance audit, which you accepted back in June 2015. We provided a couple of updates since then to you. We usually come a couple times a year with the latest implementation status. This time we've added another column. It's in track changes on the far right-hand side with the status as of January 2017. We've grayed out the recommendations that have been completed, so you can easily spot those. There have been 7 completed recommendations since June 2015. We anticipate the remaining recommendations to be either completed or well underway by the time your next performance audit begins, which is in July. And we plan to bring you another update around there, early summer. So today you are asked to discuss the status of the implementation of recommendations.
So on page 7, related to the EMP and the mitigation funding, are there opportunities for us to broaden the definition of what can and can't be used for mitigation? I mean, it's a little disheartening to hear that staff at public agencies, they don't have, they lack new road impacts. They have that new road usually privately funded. I'm curious if there's other opportunities for other things, or can we broaden it so that potential street improvements can be used?
I think that's something we would have to look at. I think right now the immediate near-term plan is to look at one of the RTIP updates to potentially reach out through that to all the local agencies, just as another reminder, hey, this is available to you. So.
Do we know, and this may be a question for later, do we know if the local jurisdictions need to have a transportation improvement fund, like a TIF, so that they utilize this program?
I think the idea behind this, the implementation status comment here is that oftentimes the information is made to the city engineers through the CPAC group, but perhaps it's the people that are managing the funds within the city that also need to be aware of this opportunity. And so we want to make that notice or availability, essentially, of funds, make them aware through the RTIP amendment process.
I was just getting concerned about the fact that if you have an impact to a certain species, then you have access to these funds, and if you don't have impact to that certain species or vegetation type, then you don't. So that, I think that maybe was something I was hoping we could take a look at, if that's one of the hindrances. I know a lot of cities are built out, so they're not impacting these resources. Maybe they're excluded.
Okay, we can take a look at that.
I have a question. Kai, I really loved what you did with the construction management manual, but what I want to know is you're the lead on it, so I figure you're the most knowledgeable. But what I'm wondering about, or maybe I should speak to Jim sitting behind you, are we passing this out to the local agencies? In other words, how are we using this? Because it probably has a wealth of information.
Yeah, because I think that I got assigned to this because I had, I don't know, I don't remember exactly what the level where we had interest of, but I think that Jim and others have been, we haven't had any formal dialogue about the project.
Thank you, Jim.
The construction manual is a SANDAG internal best practices manual. How are we going to implement our construction contracts given our own policy, our internal policies and procedures and things like that? It gets down into the even details like how do you file certain forms. So it's not really something that would necessarily be of assistance to a local city or any other local agency, but they could. And they have access to it. It's certainly available to everyone. And what's interesting is the previous version was a carryover from the Metropolitan Transit District back when these projects used to be implemented by MTDB, who uses the same process as the Caltrans construction manual. So really it's an amendment to that more than anything.
Okay, the reason I brought up the question is I remember over past months as different cities come before us and have problems. Sometimes they have problems because they didn't, I guess, have the environmental approval or the utility relocation took too long. I'm wondering, there's some group. What is the group that they call it? The cities got together and they have their own little construction group. Are they doing something to help each other out to make?
Yeah, well, first off, there's groups here that meet at SANDAG. The city traffic engineers meet, and the city public works directors meet, in addition to the city managers. And then there's a construction procurement committee that Brad, I think, do you still sit on that?
Participated. It's all the regional agencies, the facilities folks, and the engineers get together once a quarter and talk about these construction trends and issues related to some of these. So they do keep in touch with that best practices. So.
Okay.
More than happy to share it with anybody that wants to see it.
Okay, thank you. That's what I wanted to know.
Before you walk away, I mean, part of this too was, I think, because clearly with the CMDC being new and interested in what we learn along the way, and as we do other projects with similar voting methods, we take advantage of lessons learned. And I see it from the notes here, you've started documenting, having kind of formal things with the team, it looks like meeting and taking snapshots of things along the way. So at some point, when it's compiled to a point where there's some, enough to share, I think it would be interesting. I'd be interested in having some dialogue. I'm not hearing about that.
Yeah, lessons learned.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And one of the things we're taking advantage of is the fact that the I-5 North Coast Corridor is also being procured and constructed via CMGC. And so we work very closely with Alan Kossip, the corridor director at Caltrans, to try to say, okay, how we procured the CMGC compared to how they procured their CMGC and their best practices and our best practices. There's a great dialogue going, because I believe this is still, the I-5 North Coast is still the biggest CMGC project that Caltrans has ever done, because they're new to that and they had a group of pilot projects. And so we have their biggest with our first and our biggest. And so it's a great opportunity to do best practices and figure out, okay, how best do we do our next CMGC project?
Out of curiosity, it's Caltrans' biggest. What kind of a margin? I was surprised to hear that.
That is a great question, and I don't know if there's anybody else in this room that knows that.
But is it just one of many of theirs?
Yeah, Caltrans a few years ago started off with pilot projects on design build. And then they got legislation to do pilot projects under CMGC. And so they wanted to try different ways to write the specification in different types of projects. We saw, working with Caltrans, we saw the I-5 North Coast as an incredible opportunity for CMGC, because you have the rail right next to the highway and you have the lagoon work right in between. We wanted to take advantage of the contractor's knowledge of how you stage the movement and the reconstruction of an interstate freeway, and that's where you get the biggest bang for the buck for CMGC. And so we were able to do that, the rail work with the lagoon work with the highway work, all under this, working at the same table with the contractor. And so I believe this is by far the largest CMGC project they had, because they wanted to test the waters, and so that's what they're doing with their pilot projects.
they have 6 projects that were selected. The smallest is 52 million, and ours is the largest at 606 million. Some of them are real small projects, removing the foundations, relining some roads. So I think ours is probably the most complicated and most comprehensive.
I have another question for, is the 600 million include the bridges for the rail and everything?
Yes,
Okay.
yes.
Jim, you're talking about the north coast, but the mid-coast, right, all the environmental issues you were just talking about, CMGC, that was the north coast, right?
Yes.
Yeah, and then I know Dick asked about is the mid-coast project one of Sandag's
Largest ever. In fact, it's the largest single transportation project the region's ever done. With interest a little over $2 billion.
Are some of the same issues related, similar?
Oh, absolutely.
Tracking and
You know, when you think of CMGC and think of building a project like Mid-Coast just under a pure series of low bid contracts, our ability to work with the university and say, okay, what impact? Because we're not just going, we're not just touching the university, we're going right through the heart of campus. And to sit down with them and have the ability to sit down with them and a contractor to say, how best do we build this thing to minimize the impacts while maximizing the efficiencies of the project? We have avoided so many problems. It's the same with working with Caltrans because we're right along an interstate freeway, and the same with working with the city of San Diego because we go right down the heart of the second downtown up at University City and UTC area, when we go down Genesee. So the areas that we're hitting with these linear projects, the ability to have a contractor there and figure out the most efficient way to do it while still balancing out the needs of the community, the needs of the school, the needs of the interstate freeway, it's just very beneficial.
On in these projects, were you still deciding who the contractor or contractors would be based on low bid or other criteria?
Both. It's qualifications based. So the Mid-Coast Transit Constructors, MCTC, was selected to be the general contractor over this program of projects for Mid-Coast. So it's Mid-Coast and 5 other projects, including the Elvira Marina project that's on your agenda today. Then they select subcontractors because they can't do all that work themselves, and that those subcontractors are selected by a competitive best value procurement. So it's not just you have to have the ability to perform the work. They're still a subcontractor, so the contract is still with the prime, but we weigh in, the prime contractor weighs in. We selected certain criteria to make sure we were getting best overall value, which is a combination of talent and cost.
Are those subcontractors fixed price or cost type?
That depends on that depends on their relationship with the prime. They could do it many ways between them and the sub and the prime. Our price with MCTC is a guaranteed maximum price. So assuming that we don't change the scope and conditions out there of which we assume the risk for don't change, like hazardous waste, that's a risk we assume. That's a risk that every public agency assumes because you couldn't afford to pay them to assume that risk. Assuming that, and then we will get that for that guaranteed maximum price. If there are risks that come true that we are responsible for, then that number goes up. But if not, then that number stays the same.
But it's the prime contractor's
yes.
latitude to award whatever type contract
yes.
they want to do with this.
Yes.
Item number 8. Item number 9. I guess you got Michelle again.
So this is amendment number 1 to the 2016 RTIP. And on its January 20th, 2017 meeting, the Transportation Committee is scheduled to approve amendment number 1 to the 2016 Regional Transportation Improvement Program, or the RTIP. The ITALC is asked to review and discuss the projects included in this proposed amendment, focusing on the review on the Transnet-funded projects. Amendment number 1 to the 2016 RTIP is a regularly quarterly amendment and is detailed in the discussion section of your report starting on page 2. This portion details the changes for each project program with Transnet funds, and if applicable, provides the amount changed in funding. In attachment 1 of your backup, beginning on page 9, you will find the changes proposed in this amendment specifically for those projects funded with Transnet. Each project includes Transnet funding towards the top, followed by any other funding programmed on the project. We also show Transnet subtotals and other subtotals to inform you of how much Transnet and other funds are programmed on these projects. Attachment 2 and Table 2, as shown on page 58, provides a cumulative capacity analysis in regards to revenue versus programmed of Transnet Local Streets Improvements, or LSI funds, through Amendment Number 1 for all local agencies. So this includes annual revenues and carryover revenues from prior years. And then Attachment 3 includes a map showing the major transportation projects included in this amendment.
I have a question. I noticed that on your first page that the Sandag board approved this, and that was before the vote, and before I should say the election, where we knew that we're not going to be getting, more tax measure funds. Because of that particular vote, is all of this still pertinent?
Yes. These are based on the current Transnet ordinance.
Michelle, on page 4, the downtown multi-use and bus stopover facility, that's a large increase. I have two questions, sort of the large increase to add $30 million, and then is the proposal in the long run to have the offices moved there, on a building being created there for Sandag?
Yeah.
Is that where that is going to be?
Yeah, so if you remember at your October meeting, Richard Chavez brought this item to you guys for review. So it's in your October agenda if you want to go back and review some information regarding that. And yeah, this is it's a multi-use facility, so it is being reviewed as a potential Transnet office.
So this part is not related to the actual building of the office? No,
It's not
this
for
has to do with the facility. And then what's the news on the office? Is that in the works as far as a possible project for you all to move, or is that, and that's related to this facility? Some general.
Yeah, I mean, I think the history on this one is the nature of all the rapid services that we're bringing online, we've brought online with regards to Transnet. So the I-15 rapid, the mid-T rapid that alternates downtown necessitates a stopover facility, so the process drivers can take a break and then move on, turn around to the next routes. We've been working in the downtown area and working with MTS on the location, and so we get narrowed down to several locations in the downtown area. Taking a lot of public input from folks in Little Italy, really wanted them further removed from them. There were sites closer to the Little Italy. The board, I want to say, was it last year or the year before, actually narrowed down the sites and selected this one as the preferred site for the Statewide facility. Some of the other comments we got during the public process was that they didn't want, the community didn't want to use the prime public land solely for a stopover, and so I suggested we include some additional development. And so the thought came, we could do sort of a mixed-use development on top of the stopover facility. So, I mean, the primary driver for this is the need for a stopover in this location in downtown San Diego. And the building was the result of public comment and us looking financially at what it costs long-term to continue to pay rent versus potentially owning a building. And so that's where the project is right now. We're still in the due diligence phase where, we've selected a site, done some initial environmental analysis, we're really in the due diligence phase. Like a lot of the places in downtown San Diego, prior uses, we're doing some additional environmental testing in terms of both the seismic, potential seismic faults on the property, because there's some adjacent properties that have them, and then also some of the hazardous material testing. So this cost increases for the right-of-way portion as we've gone and done some of the appraisals and stuff. The cost to acquire, has gone up in terms of, actual right-of-way acquisition. Should we pursue that path?
That was a large increase, I'm just curious.
Can I follow up on that? I was curious, it's a large increase, but it's a huge percentage of the total, the revised total. The increment itself represents 2/3 of the total project. What was the source, what took the hit that supplied these funds from what other Transnet project
So the Transnet
freed up
funds
this $30 million to come support
were
this?
available. So in the plan of finance last year, they were identified as available for this project if it needed it.
Right, so when we ran the plan of finance a year ago, we ran plan of finance using the existing budgets, but we also knew that there were anticipated additional budget demands coming up. So in order to be able to say, yes, there are funds available to do that, should the board approve that, we ran it with that additional capacity. But that additional capacity was not yet in the board.
We did allocate out those additional, assuming.
Yep.
But was there an original concept that this project could have been built for $15 million? Or did it always know that $15 million was just a placeholder and you're going to need another $30 million to get to a total of 45?
Yeah, I think when the budget was initially developed, there were a number of potential options. And so as we went through the public consultation process and we heard from the community, as Kim explained, I think the consensus has been to further explore and pursue the option of building a mixed-use facility.
So the scope of the project grew dramatically from a $15 million order into a $45 million.
Were you saying also the location had implications for the cost as well, or?
Well, the location was somewhere downtown. The specific location of that downtown, had not been nailed down yet. Like Kim explained, there were other options that were closer to Little Italy. We heard from the community about some of their concerns, so we had to look for alternate locations, but also within downtown to meet the operational needs of MTS.
Kim, since he mentioned mixed use, does this mean that financially Sandag is thinking of maybe leasing out part of the building to bring in income to help pay for it, or not?
I know in our initial analysis, we had looked at different options like this. Right now, we don't have a specific mix of uses right now. We did some initial market analysis to see could the market sustain. And I want to say that's probably more than a year old now. But at the time we had done it, it could sustain some additional office and then potentially retail. I mean, there are a few uses. I think what we're doing right now is really in the early stages in terms of just is this site, are we going to be able to acquire this site, and then some additional work will be done in terms of is it more than just offices for Sandag, is it additional offices? Some of the early stuff also showed that potentially housing and other uses could be viable, but it really depends on kind of the market and what the things are. So we'll need to kind of update that study as we move forward.
So these funds, so there's a chance that spending this money that you wouldn't build a multi-use, or is it the stopover facility is being built?
No, this money really is, my understanding from this,
Right-of-way.
It's really the right-of-way. And I think the cost increases haven't been like, we thought the project was only going to cost $15 million. I think we can double check that, but we only funded it up to a certain phase.
A certain phase, right.
Yeah. So the initial sort of money that was in here wasn't entirely for the full project, my understanding.
What do the buses do now?
They park on the streets. They let them on the streets. And so it's caused some, concerns angst with the community, because there's porta potties on the sidewalks where the drivers are able to they park on the street and lock the porta potty. So it's not a long-term solution. Given where we are with the service that's being provided.
Kim, my understanding is, from a simple notion, is you're trying to get the buses off the streets. You're going to have what I call a parking lot for the buses when they're not in use. You're going to have to buy that real estate or access it somehow. You just want to be able to use the airspace above it.
Yes.
The best economical fashion.
I mean, if you look at the community plans, I mean, while public uses are envisioned in this property, this area we're looking at, I think the community plan also, you know, envisions something more than just a low-level use with buses on the street.
That would
That's
probably not be an
yes.
economic use of the real estate, so you'd
Yes.
want to go up. And is one possible alternative to relocation of the entire Sandag functions, this
But that's
potential
possible,
facility?
yes.
Where's it located?
Between A and B and Union and State. Yeah. Okay, right.
What's on the site now?
It's used for, there's half of it's, used for parking, so space parking leases it or operates a parking lot. There's some portions owned by, the American Bar Association, it's an empty building. About a quarter of the site is used by the, contractors who are building the courthouse. R&S is basically having construction trailers there. So there's about, I want to say 6 to 8, I want to say property owners. The tenants right now are different from the property owners. So like Ace has a good portion of that block, but I think there's two underlying property owners.
You could acquire that if you needed to by eminent domain?
I mean, that's a discussion.
Question, have we discussed, I'm sorry, I was listening and reading, have we discussed the San Diego project, SD 70 for the West Mission Bay Drive? It's on page 42. I think I missed that. Can you, the way I read that, San Diego is going to advance local funds of $103 million for start in 2000. This is the West Mission Bay Drive. And they expect that San Diego will advance that amount of money in 2016-17 and then get reimbursed 5 years later. Am I reading that correctly?
Right, so what the city of San Diego needs to do in order to award the contract is, essentially show the funds to the federal government. So the federal government is providing the HBP funds, but they also need to know that the city of San Diego is good in terms of having the money available up front. So that's why they need to program $103 million, and that's why it's shown in fiscal year 16-17. The project is about a 3-year construction project, and so as the project progresses, there is the possibility of advancing some of that federal money as it is being spent. So that it's called advanced construction. And so the city of San Diego would not necessarily have to spend $103 million. They wouldn't be able to spend $103 million anyways on the first year because it's a 3-year construction project. So as the project progresses, they would be able to get reimbursed by the federal government.
I guess my corollary question then is, I drive that bridge every so often. Can we expect to see the construction starting this fiscal year? Is design far enough along?
Well, just looking at where the dollars are programmed, it's probably a reasonable assumption to expect that the construction contract would be awarded this fiscal year. It takes a while for the advertisement and the award of the contract to occur, so you may not see construction actually happening for some time after that. We can find out the specific timing.
It says open to traffic December 2019.
Right.
So that would mean they expect to complete the construction.
Right. So we can find out more specifics on that.
Well, this isn't a personal question. I'm not intending it to be. I'm just, that's a big project and it affects a lot of traffic back and forth.
Right. And some of the procedural improvements that the city of San Diego has been trying to implement, a lot of those have been driven precisely because of large projects like the West Mission Bay project, where they've needed to essentially have the money on hand. Here, they just need to program their access to capital. So in this case, the city would be able to say, we can access capital, whether it's through our capital improvement program or through a commercial paper program, but they don't necessarily have to have all of that money sitting in the bank before they can award the contract.
Commercial paper.
Right.
All right.
I dropped another, the plans are 100% done and it's.
They are done, the
Yeah.
design is finished.
Yeah, they're getting rid, they're packaging it to get it out to.
They're putting it out to bid, so we
Yeah.
can expect to see
But I
something.
mean, realistically, I mean, it's a large project. I don't know if they get another strategic contractor this fiscal year or early next fiscal year, but that's
They're close. All right.
It's a major, like you said, I mean, it's it's a complete replacement, so they've got to tear down half of it, move two-way traffic over the other side, build part of the new structure, and tear down the other half, and, you know, and then they've got windows with, you know, summer seasons and things, it's a staging and construction, that's a 3-year thing, is legitimately a challenging project.
All right.
Jose, could you go back on the finance a bit? From the city's point of view, I understand they got to show the ability to front the money with the expectation the feds will come through. But how does the federal funding work? Is it based on annual appropriations?
What is?
So if the city is at risk that those annual appropriations might not materialize?
Well, remember that the federal government has their 5-year transportation authorization, right? So there is, and within that there are various programs, and within one of those programs is their highway bridge program. But it is subject to annual
So
appropriations.
it's authorized, but that doesn't mean anything. At the end of the day, you need an appropriation each year.
Right, but if you look at the past, right, every year there's been an appropriation. Sometimes there are delays. That's
So maybe this future might be a little different than the past for some reason.
Because we're in California, you think?
No, in the United States.
Well, Kim's going to talk on item 11 about forecast, revenue forecast update. And of course, one of the questions is the residential impact of all these future projections.
But this would be an example for the city. They are going some degree at risk. Based on historic, it's a low risk, but there is risk for the $123 million if the feds for some reason chose not to fund.
All right, thank you. Thanks for the
I take it that's fairly typical in many projects.
Is that Kim and ready for, oh, sorry, item number 10 is the CFAC progress report, Transnet mid-quarter project.
Good morning, everybody. So this is the quarterly report on the Transnet project status for October through December. There are 4 areas we report on: the scheduled accomplishments, the project expenditures, industry trends on bidder information, and the transportation performance measurements. So I'm going to kind of walk you through 2 of these areas, which is the scheduled and the cost. On the specific scheduled accomplishments, the Mid-Coast Light Rail broke ground for construction in October. The project will be constructed using the CFGC construction manager general contractor delivery method, and we got a very good basic 101 from Mr. Liticum a little while ago. And the expected beginning service will be in late 2021. Another key milestone, or major milestone, was 11 bus rapid transit stations were completed in downtown in October. And this marks a major milestone in our region's effort to expand rapid services to transit passengers. One of the key features was the 16-foot tall pylons that you would see when you drive around at these stations, providing a digital display on the next bus arrival, as well as the built-in security cameras. And there are several other improvements that came along with that. State Route 905, 105, 11, the northbound connectors project also opened to public in November. On the project expenditure side, at the time this report was put together, a total of $61 million was spent on the early action projects, and approximately $1.3 million was spent on the regional bikeway projects. There was significant construction activity on the Mid-City Center line, the Mid-Coast rail, Oceanside Station pass-through track, and the San Diego River Bridge are some of the key projects to be mentioned. And also there was some significant engineering effort on the I-5 North 2 HOV lanes project. That concludes my report.
I was intrigued on your cost trends at 17% annual increase in cost. Am I reading that correctly?
Where are you reading?
Right here.
Bottom of page 2.
All right. Right, so this is, so the Caltrans publishes a statewide construction cost index, and essentially they look at all of their bid information statewide on selected bid items like concrete and steel and things like that. And so depending on the size of the project, if you have small projects or large projects, the bid prices may fluctuate significantly. But regardless, they just collect all of the information and they put it into an index. So we just track that.
The index is a 70% annual increase. That's staggering.
It's pretty significant. Yeah. It's certainly not as
Union wages.
It's not as significant as it was, say, in 2005, 2006 timeframe. Back then, it was even higher than that. Yes, but it does tend to fluctuate quite a bit up and down. So it is. I mean, it is something that we do look at, but then we try to understand what's behind those numbers. So it's.
That's one input you have to use in your forecast of your expenditures that we're going to talk about shortly.
Right, and we do use. I mean, there's the Caltrans Construction Cost Index. There are other indices that reflect not just those particular bid items, but they take into account labor and things like that. So,
when you reference that you try to understand what's behind that, is there anything you could elaborate on in terms of what might be behind these numbers that would give insight as to whether there's anything particularly unusual and short-term in nature, or is this, you know, like kind of a very solid, kind of, if you will, a real ongoing kind of 17% increase that's not going to turn itself around?
I don't have anything that I can share in terms of anything that we found out, but as we proceed into the Plan of Finance update in the next couple of months, those are the kinds of things that we'll be taking a deeper dive on to try to understand and see if it makes sense.
See, the numbers came, the 17% is derived from it's the price index for selected highway construction items for the second quarter of June. So to get a final resolution of where the numbers are coming from, we might have to kind of dig into what those numbers represent. So this is coming from a DOT price index chart. That's where the numbers came from.
Absolutely staggering. Your projection of revenues are going up 2.5% a year. Of costs are going up 70% a year. Obviously,
We're in trouble.
You don't play that game very well.
Could I ask Jim? Jim, I know since you're Mr. Construction in my mind, and I know that you've had fabulous experience in the past, when you see cost increases like this, can you say, okay, the truck drivers to haul are charging much more per hour, or it's wages, or it's, steel, concrete, whatever? I mean, can you give us some kind of feel? Because I know you're in touch with all this stuff.
Yeah, like Jose said, we don't have any real hard data that points to that. I can tell you that we're experiencing, that's a statewide index, we're experiencing that also. The cost increases that we're experiencing have lagged from a lot of the country, which is, I found rather interesting, that a lot of the prices started going up a number of years ago. And in fact, I'm sure you all subscribe to the Engineering News Record, right?
Of course.
That's,
Only when I can't sleep at night.
And so they track costs, and the costs nationally have been up higher than they were in San Diego. So they've been tracking cost increases over the past couple of years, since it's been a few years since we've been out of the recession. We finally caught up with that about a year and a half ago. Our prices really started to go up, and we try to adjust. I think a lot of it has to do with, and I'll defer to Brad on this one, but we have seen locally in San Diego the consolidation of the construction industry. So there's fewer contractors, fewer small contractors. If there's a little bit less competition, then you're going to, prices are going to go up. With the measure that was passed in LA and some of the other public works projects that are, being pushed out, some of the mega projects, you see less competition. And especially since there are also, my sense is, fewer contractors than we've had locally anyway in my entire career. So, I don't know
No, I
if you
think
agree with that.
Jim's hit it on the nose, and material prices are really, they continue to creep up. Yeah.
But creep, not
17%
70%.
isn't a
But
creep,
it is
is it?
creeping up, and then when you include other factors, there are other factors on prevailing wage issues that are coming up at the state level that was passed by the governor and the legislature on things. So there's other factors besides of that. So our chief economist for Agency of America is coming out to speak on February 7th, and I've invited Jim and a number of folks, and any of you can come. He comes every year and talks about what's happening in the trends throughout the country. But it just depends on what materials are going up more than less. So.
We would not expect this 17% per year.
Yeah, I know.
This is,
Some of this is profit margin expansion, that there's been a consolidation in the industry. Times are better now. The lean margins are gone. We're getting back to.
and they can use that money to reinvest in equipment and plants and things like that. That hopefully we'll see the efficiencies of going forward.
And steel and cement sure are not rebounding that rapidly.
But many, many materials, especially in San Diego, just the price of dirt, the price to buy dirt and the price to get rid of dirt.
But when you talk about hauling, I remember that it's not really the soil. It happens to be how much it costs to move it.
Absolutely.
It was an attention getter. 17%.
Anything else? Okay, thank you. Item 11, program revenue forecast update. Kim and Ray.
Good morning. Oh, are you going first? Okay.
So? So, we're here today, we did a presentation to the board back in December, and a lot of it was, they had asked us, same time we provide a quarterly update, ITAC on the board. They had asked us, shortly after the November elections and stuff, and then asked us to come back and give them a report on the health of the Transnet program, where we are in terms of revenues and costs in terms of our major corridor program. So I'm sure you're familiar with some of the news clips, and then your chairman, Stuart, actually had the pleasure of speaking with the reporter as well in terms of questions about our revenue forecasting process. Were they perhaps too optimistic both for the existing program as potentially for Measure A? So it really was a check-in with the board, and we thought we would come back and also give you the same presentation. Really focused on our major corridor program that Cetha was talking about, so the major capital efforts. In terms of overview, Ray's going to talk about some of the things we were just chatting about, sort of where we are in terms of both on the program revenue side, what we're seeing with costs moving forward. I'll give you a little bit of background of the major corridor program and highlight some of the work, show some pictures. And then we'll talk about kind of where we are, what future funding opportunities, and then next steps. And then right now I'll just turn it over to Ray. He'll get into some of the numbers.
So each year, as part of the Transnet program, we develop a forecast of that plan of finance. And the forecast that we develop for the plan of finance takes into account where we are year to date with revenue collections, current economic conditions. It takes into account information we get from the Board of Equalization, other sources. And we also use a long-term derivative from our demographic and economic forecasting model that we have internally that gives us a growth rate that we use for the long-term forecast. So what we're trying to do here is create a forecast really for budgeting purposes for the Transnet program. So this isn't a sales tax revenue predictive model that we've been writing. This is really a budget and forecast, and I think that's important as we go forward. But in light of the recent news reports that were out there, one of the things we decided to do is to take a closer look at the methodology that we were using to forecast sales tax revenue. And what we found was that the Sandag's DEFM model, the demographic and economic forecasting model that is used for long-term forecast, was overestimating taxable retail sales. So what we are doing, the last time that model was updated was in 2012. We're in the process of rebuilding that model for 2014 as part of for 2018 as part of our work program anyway for Series 14. But what we did to be extremely conservative and to essentially take our forecast for Transnet and decouple it from the DEFM forecast is that we created an independent forecast of sales tax revenue. We used independent sources to do that. So we used nationally recognized forecast, and I did a consensus forecast that allowed us to come up with a new forecast that can't be, is not tied back to the DEFM forecast. But what I wanted to show here is that in the last 30 years, this is the percent change that we've seen in sales tax revenue collection. And what you can see is that it's literally all over the map. Okay, the blue line represents the average. Yellow lines represent when we had a positive growth. The red bars represent when we've had negative increases or decreases in sales tax revenue. You can see that it goes from a high of 18% increase, which was the first year, down into the Great Recession where we were losing 9 or 10% per year in revenue. So pretty difficult stuff to try to draw any trend line to. The average of this is about 4%. And in the next 30 years, so this is what happened in the last 30 years. Okay? So we take a look at what's going to happen in the next 30 years because that's what the plan of finance is based on. And the 2015 plan of finance, the one that would have been presented to you last year, had an average growth rate of 4.4%. The new forecast has an average growth rate of about 3.9%. It's about 0.5% lower, the net result of this over 30 years is a reduction of about 15% in terms of revenue coming from this one particular line item, which is Transnet, that goes into the plan of finance. So there's a lot of different sources of revenue that are in Transnet that Kim's going to talk about later. This particular one we reduced by 15%.
Frank, can you give us a little color on what was the underlying causes for your need to, or what change in your models that dropped the 4.4 down to 3.9?
So
was it based on the historical numbers?
So based on the historical numbers, so within DEFM, we found an error in the extract transform load process, which is where we pull the data and we aggregate it into economic sectors that we forecast. So we buy data from a vendor, and it comes in 200 or 300 different economic sectors. It's about 300, and what we do is we roll that up into 50 that we forecast. And there was an issue in the way we added up the income numbers, and so that impacted taxable retail sales. So that's an independent problem. But with that said, even if we'd fix that error in DEFM would still be forecasting a little bit too aggressively, because if you think about this last recession, we came out of it much more slowly than we did any other recession. And so if you go back to 2012, which was when this forecast was done, the analysts at the time estimated that we'd be coming out of a recession at a steeper slope. So DEFM would had thinking we were going to have higher retail sales and higher growth rates. So every 4 years we end up recalibrating the model, and so this line would have been brought down anyway. It just happens to be that from a timing perspective, it came into the news, so we took a look at it. It's being rewritten, it's all new code anyway, so that's going to go away. The 3.9%, the reason that it seems a little bit low has a lot to do with two factors. One is inflation rates, which have been low now for many years, and there are no forecasts that really show it going up significantly. These forecasts that we do for the plan of finance are in year of expenditure dollars. So one of the large components is inflation. And the second thing is, over the last 10 years, there's been no growth in real in wages or income, in real purchasing power, and therefore people aren't spending more on retail sales. So you're pretty flat there. In that case, the only thing that can really drive sales tax revenue increases would be population growth, and we haven't had very much population growth recently either. So the slope of the line would be lower. So those are some of the factors that are that feed into the 3.9.
What's the historical relationship between sales tax revenues in nominal dollars and GDP growth in nominal dollars?
They're highly correlated in terms of GDP. The amount of growth that we would have regionally is highly correlated with the amount of retail sales tax that we would generate. So, but there are other leakages that happen in the sales tax that I'll get into later also.
But you're still showing something greater than most people would be projecting for GDP growth for the future.
Well, 3.9%, but you have to understand that includes 2.7% inflation rate. And also, there's a population growth increase component in this, as well as some real rates of increase in terms of wages and salaries, which would be retail sales growth. So there's three components that add into that. Yes, sir.
One thing that I'm just trying to reconcile is, I don't know if you recall, at our October meeting, I in fact pointed out that at least for the past 3 years, the variance between your budgeted sales tax revenue versus actual, the variance actually had been shrinking. I don't know if you remember
right.
that very brief conversation about that.
We were very close.
Yeah, and so it just seems, in light of the fact that the variances were actually getting being reduced, that there then become, I guess I'm still curious as to what was the catalyst for thinking that there was some error in your forecasting when at least the near-term results suggested that you know, your budgeting was awfully darn accurate.
Yeah, so the near term, sorry, there's a slide that might show it better, but we used two models, and that was kind of the next slide. So we used two different models for doing the forecast. The questions that came up in the Voice of San Diego were about the long-term forecast that we did 20 some odd years ago when we originally did Transnet. Okay, that's what the article was written about, is the DEFA model. The one you're referring to, where we're pretty close, is the short run model, where we do the 2 to 3 year calibration. So for the first 3 to 5 years, really, what we do is we calibrate what we believe is happening in the economy based upon the factors I talked about when I first started talking, which is the actual collections that we have. We take a look at economic factors, we look at growth rates, unemployment, employment, those type of things. So we have a better idea of what's going on in the short run, and we're looking specifically at retail, at taxable sales, okay, when we do that forecast. The long-term DEFM forecast is really looking at retail sales, and then as a percentage of that, you would get taxes for the entire region. Okay, and it doesn't take into account any type of economic cycle. So if we are expanding very quickly, it's not going to take that into account. The long-term model is a directional model. It's a straight line, essentially, that says, here's where we believe we will be 40 years from now. Okay, and so we'll have ups and downs around that particular line. The reason we're closer in the short run is because we have the short run model that we calibrate on the front end. Does that make sense? Yeah. So this is our previous methodology. So what we did in every plan of finance prior to this one, we take the growth rate from the long run model. Now this, Sandag has historically used the DEFA model to generate these growth forecasts. Other MPOs just use straight 2.5%. Some use 5%. Some use a combination of population and inflation. Not every MPO does this the same way. We happen to have our own internal model that forecasts retail sales and taxable retail sales, so what we end up doing is using the growth rate.
And basically, if I'm understanding correctly, you sort of pick a rate and then that's the rate. You don't do any kind of Monte Carlo probabilistic scenarios as to say what are the odds that we actually will have sufficient revenue. You basically just pick a number.
Absolutely, because what we're using this for in the plan of finance is for budgeting reasons, for long-term projects, right? Because we're planning out 5, 10, 15 years, what do we believe we're going to be able to build when, based upon how much money comes in. And the thing that, I mean, we could put a probability range on it if we wanted to be able to give the Transnet group a little bit more, I guess, specificity, that we would fall somewhere within this range. But at the end of the day, what we don't want to do is to forecast or try to forecast recessions and expansions in the economy. Because if we miss it, like if you go back a year ago, the majority of the economists were saying we would be in a recession at the end of this year or going into next year. If we would have forecast a recession, then we would forecast a lot less revenue in the Transnet program, which would have caused problems in our ability to build infrastructure. So we typically, we have a straight line that we forecast.
So I would just say, just, you know, in light of, you know, the media controversy about all this sort of stuff, I would just say, just from, you know, a thought by way of feedback, I think it might be constructive to consider for the public communication to actually do that kind of probabilistic scenario, because at least I think a certain amount of the way the issue was framed was, will Sandag have enough money to complete the project?
Right.
And so that becomes an inherently probabilistic kind of question. And I think if you actually, you know, did that kind of analysis and just had it out there, it would sort of help the PR of it all. Does that make sense?
No, it does, and one of the things that, you know, we have talked about for future forecasting is that instead of forecasting a point, we forecast a range. Because I will be the first to tell you that there is no human being on the face of the planet, including myself, who knows exactly what's going to happen 40 years from now. I don't know what interest rates are going to be in 2036.
Yeah, and beyond the PR aspect of it, actually for your
So,
own internal planning, it probably gives you a little bit of a greater sense.
It does, and we would be able to do a
Yes.
range. It's
Right.
more sophisticated modeling that the old code base was not able to handle. It was a straight line forecast. Going
Gotcha.
forward, as we rebuild it, as the chief economist, I would like to see that type of improvement in the product. I think it's a little more difficult to explain to the board that we think we're going to be somewhere in this range, but I think they need to get used to that idea. I mean, that's it. Yeah,
That's reality.
The thing is, we
They
can
need to
run.
get used to that idea.
Yeah, well, with the modern computing capabilities, we can run literally hundreds or thousands of scenarios and come up with these ranges. Whereas before, we weren't able to do that. The way the existing model is, we weren't able to do that.
Well, and to the extent that part of the board's job is kind of managing or, you know, giving some perspective or guidelines as to the risk tolerance of the organization. I mean, I'm sure, you know, Dick's nodding because when you're involved with the pension board, this is exactly the kind of stuff that you have to get into, right? I mean, as a board, I would think you'd also want to have some sense of what's the risk that you don't make the forecast.
Right. Right, and I think that's a great suggestion, and it's one I think that I would like to see incorporated into our forecast, because trying to defend a straight line point forecast when you have the type of variations that you've seen, it's very difficult. If we get it right, it's because we guessed. To tell you the truth, if you go back here, the average here, if you took the average of all of this, it's 4.4%. None of these bars are actually 4.4%, right? They're either above or below, but they're not exactly. And so, you know, we're working. I mean, it's easy to poke holes in it 20 years later after you've done the forecast to say that you're low or high, but you kind of have to take yourself back to the point of when that forecast was done also to understand why it is what it is.
I think Stuart's point is right on. It's an issue of conditioning the public to the complexities that you're having to deal with, and there are no certainties in the world, and the public always wants simplistic answers, and the world isn't that way.
Right. No, I agree, and I'd like to go more in that direction. I don't have any. I actually like that. I don't have any problems with it at all.
I'm also concerned about the media's attempt to focus the public's attention on this, and it's unclear as to what they're focusing on. Is it the Transnet piece? I mean, you're in the memo or whatever it is.
Yeah.
You're talking about the 6.3 million or the 20 billion or the 27.8 billion. The Transnet piece that you're working so hard to have precise forecasts on, and this is less than 1/4 of the total to finish the projects. And we have absolutely no control over the other 3/4.
Right. Well, and the control that we have
We're
is
playing with the wart and the tail of the dog here.
Yes, it's our ability to get other funding sources, right? Either state or federal, and that's what we do as an organization, is to try to match the money that we have from Transit. Transit gives us the ability to borrow when we need to. I mean, it's one source of funds. It's like when you're retiring, that's your 401k. There's a lot of other things that are in your retirement, and all of them work together.
I better hope so.
Well, yeah. So,
but my point is, with managing the public's expectations, we're really focusing on the $6 billion piece here, and putting a lot of effort into it. That's just a lever to attempt that we will get 4 times that money someplace else.
We're putting a lot of leverage in that. And the other thing too is that we don't understand, I mean, the components of that's sales tax. It includes things like, gas taxes, for instance. We collected $1 million less in gas taxes second quarter this year compared to second quarter last year, just because the prices were lower. That means we have to make up $200 million in retail sales somewhere else in the economy to just break even. So there's all these micro things that are happening too. Internet sales are draining away sales tax, out of the area. So the 6.3, there is a probability it could be higher or lower, right? And so putting on some type of error bars.
I'm just saying, make sure the public is aware that there's a variation for 6.3, but there's a much, much bigger variation on the rest of the show that you have no real control over, let alone ability to project.
And that's true too. That's absolutely true. So this is the previous methodology. So I just wanted to point out that it used growth rates from DEFM. It doesn't use the forecast from DEFM. And that's an important distinction. So it's what we believe the growth rate was going to be for taxable retail sales. Now, we switched the forecast, so the current methodology still uses the same 2 to 3 year calibration model because it's relatively accurate to use the most current information. But what we did is instead we used a long run consensus forecast that does not include any aspect of taxable retail sales. So now we're doing a forecast using a per capita tax rate that people pay. So it was about $88 per capita that we were paying here in the region. And then what we're doing is we're adding factors for population growth, inflation, and real rates of increases in retail sales to that number. Okay, so and I can talk a little bit more about that if you want. But instead of coming from the top down, we're now going from the bottom up because we have historical information on how much tax we've collected. Okay, so we know historically what we've collected. So we created a model that builds from the bottom up. But it's completely independent of DEFM, and that. Yes.
And so then, where do the assumptions come from as far as inflation rates and things of that nature?
So for this particular, and some of this has to do with timing because our Series 14 model isn't completed yet. It's going to an expert review panel in February. Once we get blessing from that, it goes to the board. It gets adopted. So we're still a ways out from having new numbers from our forecasts. So for this year, what we did, because of a timing purpose, is I took 3 nationally recognized vendors. It was Woods & Pool, Moody's, and IHS Global Insights. So I took 3 forecasts, and what I did is a consensus forecast of those 3. So the inflation rate is a consensus of those 3 forecasts. The rates of growth for retail sales is a consensus of those 3 forecasts. And I applied those numbers to our estimated population growth rates that we do because we have a better idea of what's happening locally than the national forecasters do. And the reason I say that is that we understand about land constraints and building permits and things like that, whereas they would allocate more population to the San Diego region. All of them had higher 4-year population forecasts than we did, is the bottom line. And if I did that, what would have happened is that this number would have been much higher. But it's also unrealistic. It's out of alignment with our population numbers. So that's how we did this forecast, and we used this for the 2016 Plan of Finance. And in 2017, my hope is that we would go back to using our demographic and economic forecasting model as the long-term driver because it would now be calibrated back into the current year. So and all the models would be fixed. So this slide shows the change in Transnet revenue collection year over year. It's the same graph that I showed before. And you go back to the period over here when we first started collecting data. Reagan was still in office at the time. He was just handing over to George Bush. The internet had not really been invented yet. The World Wide Web took hold in 1989. Berlin Wall fell. I mean, this is a long time ago. There were no, the cell phones were those big bricks. So there's a bunch of events that occurred that completely that change the economy, and therefore impact the sales collection. And my point for even pointing this out is when you take a look at everything that's happened in the last 30 years, you can imagine what's going to happen in the next 30 years. So I did a straight line forecast. I guarantee you that that's not right. I guarantee you that the next 30 years will look much more like the last 30 years. I just don't know where the peaks and valleys are going to be for planning purposes. But if you take a look at what happened over here, we had an oil price shock over here because of when Iraq invaded Kuwait. Okay, so that's what happened there. Then we had a savings and loan crisis that pushed us into the 90-91 recession. We came out of the 90-91 recession in something that was called the Jobless Recovery. I don't know if you remember that. There were a couple of years where the economy was growing, but we weren't adding any new jobs to the economy. And it kind of reflects itself in the fact that we didn't have a lot of sales tax increases during this recession. We then went into the longest expansion in the history of the economy. It went for 10 years, and it culminated with the dot-com bust. And then we went into a recession over here, followed by September 11th, which really pushed us down. And then you see we went through another expansionary period. And then as we went into the Great Recession, we had the subprime mortgage crisis, the housing bubble, the financial crisis, the automobile industry crisis. This is just a few years ago, but this impacted our sales tax revenue. When it was over, we came out like gangbusters over here, okay? And this is 2012. This is where the last forecast was done from. And you can see any of these expansions. You know, if you're kind of doing a forecast, you'd say you'd be coming out. You know, the slope would look like this, right? The slope would look like this. Over here, the slope looks like this. And this is different than any other recovery that we've had. I mean, you've heard of the $3 trillion gap coming out of this recession. And so we see that collections have been low in the last couple of years, and we expect that to be true this year and possibly into next year also. So with that, if you take a look at what we've collected overall through history, you'll see that we are on an uptrend. You can see this is the actual collections. In the last 5 years, or last 4 years, we've collected over $250 million per year from the Transnet sales tax. We hit an all-time high the last 4 years, or actually since we came out of the recession, we've been hitting all-time highs. But we've collected over $250 million in the last 3 years, and that's going to be true for 2017 also. When we take a look at the construction cost index, and this is what Jim and Jose were talking about a little bit before, this graph shows the index. 2007 is 100, and what you'll see that it peaked over here in 2007 late, and this peak over here is right when we were at the height of the, right before we went into the last expansions, right when we started going into the last recession. As we went into the recession, you see that the construction costs went down. It's this time period where Sandag put their foot on the gas, as they said, and we built a lot of projects while construction costs were low. But you can see how construction costs have started to increase, and now they're actually at the highest that they've been since we've been collecting this data. And as Jim alluded to too, the number of bidders makes a big difference in terms of the type of bids that we get. And this is kind of the inverse of the last one. Going right before the last recession, you'll see that we had an average of about 3 bidders per job. Not a lot of competition. But as we went into the recession, we ended up with more bidders per job, peaking at about 10.5. Okay, and then you'll see that it's come down over the last couple of years, and we're now back down to about 4 or 5 bidders per job. And as the market gets better for construction, what you'll see is fewer bidders, and that pushes the prices up too. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Kim to kind of talk about how this all goes together.
The number of bidders chart was statewide, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So before I get into that part, I thought we'd just kind of real brief refresher on the major corridors. I'll show you some pictures of the work that's been accomplished, and then we'll get to talking about the program costs and revenues moving forward. We've seen this chart. This is really the flow of funds from the Transnet ordinance. So the future, dollars, $17.4 billion is really the whole program. It flows into different buckets after some off-the-top funds for admin, for ITOC. Goes to local street and roads. There's Transnet existing and new services. There's some grant programs, and really our major focus is on the major corridor capital projects, which is the largest share of single pot where the Transnet dollars go. So out of the $17.4 billion in future Transnet moving forward, about $6.3 billion would be dedicated to the major corridor programs.
Kim, as a point of reference,
Right.
rarely do we ever really go back and refocus on this basic ordinance
Right.
chart. The major corridor project we've mentioned many times so far today is the Transnet money is used to leverage much bigger dollars.
Yes.
Are there any other buckets that work in the same fashion where the Transnet dollars are used not just by themselves, but they also leverage other dollars for major, but larger projects and what otherwise could be paid for by Transnet?
Yeah, I mean, if you
Like
look.
bicycles or anything, is it just, that's just Transnet money? There's no other money that comes into play there?
No, I mean, well, for any of the grant programs, there's matching dollars. Basically, some of the people get
Yeah, the
perform
participants.
better in the competition if they bring certain levels of matching dollars. So from a lot of these buckets, if you will, there are matching dollars that are brought in.
But nothing like the major where it's a multiple of the Transnet dollars.
You do see multiple. I mean, you use even the cities. If you look at
Yeah, if you look at this, if you look at, say, the art tip, you know, a lot of the cities match Transnet dollars with their own money or federal money or state grants. So it's really, you know, it applies to most of them. If you look at the transit services, those are matching the fares that are collected plus other state revenues or federal revenues that the transit agencies collect. So.
it's a good question. So this is where, and then in terms of the ordinance itself, if you actually look through the ordinance, there's tables in there, and there's about 48 individual projects that are listed that comprise the major corridor capital projects. They're, you know, both freeway widenings or there's new HOV lane connectors, new freeway connectors, new transit services. So there's about 48 projects there. The early action program is how the board has chosen to start to implement the major corridor program. So you recall the transit extension actually was approved by voters in 2004. It didn't start collecting revenues until 2008. So 2008 to 2048 is the 40-year term. But in January of 2005, shortly after voters approved the extension, the board elected to create what they called the early action program. And they really wanted to jumpstart projects. They wanted to get the capital program underway in advance of some funding coming in. And the strategy really was to invest those dollars in early design and engineering work to basically position the region for future funding opportunities, rather than sort of the pay-go program, you know, where you save up your money to do a project at a time or one or two projects at a time. So it really was a sort of an acceleration and advancement of the capital program. It takes discipline and sort of a financial strategy, so hence the investment in doing plans of finance on at least an annual basis, if not more frequently, and really taking a look at construction costs, where revenues are coming in, and making sure that that's sort of discipline and fiscal strategy of the board. So, which is what basically we bring both to the board as well as the ITOC. In terms of the status, it's a 40-year program, so we're about 8 years in from 2008 to 2016 roughly. And then 8 years into this 40-year measure, we have about 40% of those 48 projects that are underway, either completed or under construction. Over the next 32 years, at the year 2048, there's about 29 major corridor capital projects that are yet to be fully completed, although there has been some preliminary engineering and environmental work and some planning studies underway on a few of those. Just at a high level, these are all the major corridor projects that either have been fully completed or underway. If you look at them as a whole, what it really has focused on in terms of the early action program is really building out the region's high HOV or high occupancy vehicle or managed lane network. It's been really about launching these bus rapid transit, what we've branded rapid services. And it really was also focused, the early action program, on completing those projects, 3 primary ones that were what we call the lockbox projects, the 3 projects that actually remained from the original Transnet measure, and that's State Route 76, the Midcoast project itself, and then State Route 52. Pictures worth 1,000 words, so I thought we can run through some of the pictures. 52 widening was completed so the additional widening was completed in 2009 to address a bottleneck coming out of Santee along the 52, and we completed the extension, which is one of these carryover projects from the original measure, the extension of State Route 52 from 125 to 67 in 2010. The Super Loop was one of our earliest new transit services that the extension made possible, and this is basically a circulator service in the UTC area, University City area, serving, you know, what's, if not our largest, one of our largest employment centers. These have been really sort of good news stories. When the circulator first started, it carried about, I'd say, 2,000 to 3,000 riders. Today, our average weekday ridership hovers around 15,000. A lot of it because of the employment and, you know, because it's, you know, coming out of the recession, but also in part because organizations like UC San Diego, their student body several years ago voted in sort of a universal transit pass. So they're paying some, as a student, they're able to ride transit, or it pays for public transit. And so we're seeing really a lot of ridership serving the UC San Diego campus and hospitals. In terms of the Rapid Network, that also has been a huge focus of the early action program. Services were launched in 2014, a few years ago, and we've seen significant growth on a lot of those routes. Mid-City Rapid, which runs along El Cajon and Park Boulevards, really through the heart of the urban area, is carrying about 7,000 riders on a daily basis, up on an average weekday, up from about 5,000 when the service first opened. So it's actually one of the top 10, in the top 10 of the bus routes serving the San Diego region. So it's been a real success there. Rapid 235 is the service from Escondido. We have a lot of service we've put along the I-15 corridor. All-day service supplemented by express service, which are in the peak period, which are really point-to-point service. And we have seen ridership on those. Averaged about 2,000 to 3,000 riders when this service first opened, and now it's nearly doubled. It's about 5,000 riders. So these new types of sort of high-quality, express, all-day public transit services, these rapid services, are really sort of paying off. I mean, we're showing really good ridership as a result of that. The express lanes themselves were some of the earliest things built with the transit extension. The full 20 miles of express lanes, I know many of you guys use them to come down here to downtown. And although to the corridors working well now, it was not too long ago where it was considered one of the worst corridors. I mean, worse than Interstate 5. And so the improvements there in terms of the express lanes and the added rapid services has really sort of helped meet, sort of mitigate traffic congestion by providing new travel choices on there. We've been looking at, and your regular reports kind of on the performance measures, we look at ridership and kind of the carrying capacity of these lanes. Now your average lane, like an average general purpose lane, will carry roughly about 2,000 people per lane, maybe 2,000, 2,100. When it's congested in the peak hours, that drops to somewhere around 1,600, 1,700 people per lane. The express lanes themselves, in 2015, which is actually the year we have full data for, the express lanes in the morning period moved about 2,600 people per hour, which is 3% higher than the year before. And in the evening peak, they've actually carried about 2,900 people per hour. So significant in terms of moving capacity, much larger, and it has been preserved over time, even with the growth and the rebound from the recession. The middle segment of 76 was completed in 2012. Caltrans is just about nearly complete with the last segment. So this is another one of those lockbox projects. So the last easternmost segment between Mission and I-15 is under construction and expected to be open to the public this calendar year. And then Jim had been mentioning it all during this last several years, but more than a $600 million investment was made in some of the oldest trolley infrastructure. The blue and orange lines were really the track work, stations, catenary systems, and other systems really were brought up to a state of repair. And then moving to the south, another example of the build-out of sort of the HOV managed lanes network. The 2 HOV lanes on 805 South in Chula Vista opened earlier. The direct access ramp just opened last week?
Yes.
Yes, right. And so what's important about this project and these improvements is they will serve the future South Bay Rapid, which was underway and expect to be open to new riders in 2018. So these are some of the infrastructure that's needed to serve the long-term rapid system. And then also down south, something also completed late last year were the connectors, northbound connectors between sort of the spaghetti down here, State Routes 905, 125, and 11. It helps get really people kind of in the border areas off city streets. We're hoping it will drive additional traffic to our 125 toll road. Over the long term, this segment will also serve the future connection to the new border crossing that's planned at Otay Mesa East. And then under construction, real quickly, the Mid-City Center Line stations are under construction right now in the Mid-City area. At El Cajon Boulevard and University. I mentioned South Bay BRT. We're under construction with the first phase through the eastern section of Chula Vista. Coastal Rail Trail, real success story, but very challenging. You know, it's about when we first started the program about 8 or so years ago. About half of the line was double tracked. Right now we've added since that time about 10.6 miles or so of double tracking. And so either fully constructed or sort of underway, about 2/3, we're getting that double tracking up to about 2/3 of the whole line. Now where that matters is it provides more operational flexibility and reduces delay, so you don't have sections of single track where you basically trains need to stop and wait to pass one another. In terms of for the traveling public, it's helped a lot. Amtrak last year actually added 2 new trains going from San Diego to LA. So for folks that, like we do, every now and then to LA, it's a nice way to basically be able to get up there to downtown LA without sitting in traffic for 2, 3, or 4 hours. So there's about 12 Amtrak trains per day. And so over time, as long as sort of funding comes in, this has been a real sort of, Transnet really has provided the matching funds, because from the state level as well as the federal level, there is a focus on trying to improve passenger rail service. Mid-Coast, we've talked about a lot. Our single most project, construction's underway. Started last year with utility relocation, but the contract's been awarded, and so this is the single most. The picture here is the acceptance of our $1 million full funding grant agreement. And then if you've traveled along I-5 anywhere near Genesee, you've seen the tremendous work that Caltrans has been doing to kind of reconstruct that interchange, widen the bridge across Genesee. When it's fully done, it's going to provide better access both on and off to the Torrey Pines Mesa, where a lot of our biotech communities are, and then to the regional hospitals where we have Scripps, we have UC San Diego and stuff. It's a real need. One of the things that we're doing, not only to the freeways itself, but also providing access, because we actually do have bikes that use this, and I would never bike this area, because I think it's for your average bicyclist, it's not. I would say the most inviting. So we're actually building some pedestrian and bikeway crossings as part of this project as well. And the North Coast, another big project we've talked about, it's Caltrans' largest CMGC project, just got underway a couple weeks ago. The Caltrans has broken ground on the first phase of that, which is both the highway, the rail, and then both the lagoons as well as bicycle pedestrian infrastructure. So sort of wrapping up on that, the board strategy in terms of their objective to advance projects has worked. So looking forward, what remains to be completed with the major corridors program. So at the highest level, to complete the remaining projects, the current estimate is we need about there's about $27.8 billion, and these are all in year of expenditure dollars. What we did was we looked at the capital cost and incorporated the capital costs from the board's most recent regional transportation plan, the regional plan, San Diego Ford, the regional plan. We've pulled those cost estimates into the program. It did represent a change in how we had been including or looking at the major corridors program in the past. When the program was first adopted, when the board first put together the ordinance, there were capital project estimates included as part of the original ordinance. And as we brought plan of finance initially, we've basically kept those figures and escalated that to sort of a year of expenditure. Well, things have changed the last decade. I mean, we've learned a lot more as we've done additional planning or preliminary engineering with regard to these capital projects. And so we felt this was sort of re-baselining things, rather than just looking at estimates and escalating estimates that were potentially a decade old. We thought it'd be best to actually use the estimates from the regional transportation plan. The difference in those, obviously there's changes over time with inflation and costs, but we've learned, if I can give you an example, for example, on the State Route 78 corridor, where the ordinance itself had a certain cost estimate that included the widening that would be needed to add 2 new HOV lanes in the 78 corridor. Well, as Caltrans has been looking and doing some initial project study reports, they feel that there's a need to actually not just add the lanes, but actually rebuild the bridges and the overcrossings that in that same corridor. So that's an example where the cost estimates, that were included in the regional transportation plan were in fact different. I mean, in terms of there's additional scope included in that. So we've included these, like I said, the most up-to-date estimates from the planning process, which is the San Diego Forward, the regional plan. And it's about, compared to last plan of finance, on whole, it's about $8.4 billion difference. So we've talked a lot about the revenue side, but when you pay attention to the cost side too, that's a significant portion of where we are in the project. Capital costs also include about $5.2 billion in debt service, and so this includes the debt that has been issued to date. I think we've issued about $1.9 billion of outstanding debt, so it includes that debt service that's paid through the remainder of the program. We've also included a placeholder for the TIFIA loan that we have under discussion for Mid-Coast, and then I think a small issuance, future issuance the next couple of years. And that really would wrap up sort of the remainder of what we can envision at this point for the debt program for the Transnet extension. Of course, you need to balance costs and revenues. So on the revenue side, the $27.8 billion includes the $6.3 billion that Ray had talked about from the new forecast that we put together. And we would need basically another $21.5 billion. $4 billion of that is already, funding is known. It's in the RTIP, in the short range improvement program. And then of the remaining, we need about $17 billion of funding. And that would comprise itself both of future formula funding over time, and then really other discretionary funds that the region would hope to attract. And in the past, it's been funding sources like Prop 1B back in 2006, or the infusion from the economic stimulus program at the federal level in 2009. They'd really be attracting those types of funds.
Question?
Of funds.
Question?
Of funds.
Again, you're projecting future additional revenues from the future on a 3-to-1 basis. Are all those are all the remaining projects started? In other words, what is the obligation in the future years in case some of these anticipated funds that we are expecting to get from other sources, if they're not what we anticipate? What's our future obligation over the $22.6 billion capital cost on remaining projects?
So in terms of our obligation, obviously I think the board would want, in the ideal world, we'd like to complete all these projects by the time the tax expires or sunsets in
Right.
2048.
I understand.
So that's the goal. In terms of the projects that are underway right now that are completed and underway, there's sufficient funding to complete those.
All
What
right.
we're really talking about are the remaining projects that haven't been started. I mean, I think the process with the plan of finance is to look at each year and see where we are in terms of revenues coming in and costs coming in. What's really going to happen is we're going to transition from this sort of debt-supported program to a pay-as-you-go program.
Okay.
And it's really going to be paying off the debt service for the projects that are completed.
Yes, you have to do that.
Yes, and then as money's collected over time, building out the remaining projects in the program. So there's a desire to complete them all, and depending on where revenues come in and the timing of those revenues and where costs are coming in at the time, will sort of dictate that. But we do, a sort of big picture sort of takeaway from this, we do, if looking forward over the next 3 years, we're able to attract the same level of funding, about a 3-to-1 ratio, as we have in the past, 3 decades looking back.
Right.
We do feel we can complete the major corridor projects.
Thank you.
A series of questions.
Right.
One, I think I heard you just say that all the existing in-process projects are, quote, fully funded.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes, I mean, there's...
When we say fully funded, is that dependent upon any state or federal annual appropriations?
Yes.
Yet to be materialized. So they're fully funded in
Yes,
concept,
yes.
but we're at risk if that appropriation doesn't come?
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, I mean, if you look at the fully funding is looking at the current RTIP, so that's the 5-year look ahead. And, you know, like what we just talked about, those are included in federal authorizations and things like that, but they are subject to the annual appropriations.
I mean,
right.
The headline this morning, Governor Brown says we got another crisis coming, and who knows what's going to
Right.
Okay. I'm trying to make sure I understand the debt service situation. If I'm reading this correctly, it says that we expect to receive additional Transnet funds of the $6.3 billion over the remaining life of the ordinance. The first obligation of that 6.3 is 5.2 must go to debt service.
Correct.
So of all the remaining Transnet funds, forgetting the leverage, Transnet
Right.
funds, essentially none of it is available for project completion.
Very small percentage, yeah. Very small projected funds.
That's very critical for people to understand,
Yes.
that we've spent the future already. I'm overstating the case.
Yes, but yes.
We have spent the future. I've never met a politician who doesn't want to spend tomorrow's tax revenue today. The question is, your photos here give a snapshot of what we have accomplished. And the vast majority of these things are the classic concrete in the ground that's going to last
Right.
forever. So future taxpayers are, if they're just paying debt service, are not getting new projects, but they got the benefit of these long-term projects.
Yes.
To what extent was any of that debt used for trolley cars and buses, which will be obsolete long before the debt's paid off?
Actually, I can answer that. The trolley cars were paid off. The entire project was paid for with a combination of Proposition 1B funds, which were state funds, Proposition 1A funds, also state funds, stimulus funds, Transnet, and some formula funds, but state and federal formula funds. The vehicles themselves were paid for with state funds.
So we didn't borrow any money to buy short-lived debt. And then one other question, if I could, the commitment to the high occupancy lanes.
Right.
To what extent, I'm sure you do, but what can you tell us about our monitoring of the utilization of those high occupancy lanes? And does the creation of additional high occupancy lanes really change behavior such that people will carpool? And do we have any way of knowing the results of that versus just building more regular lanes? Where do we get more, where does the taxpayer get more bang for their buck? Another regular lane or a high occupancy lane, or are we just looking for more social issues here to reduce?
Yeah, I don't know if we've done a study specifically as whether or not the presence of high occupancy vehicle lanes have caused folks to carpool. I know looking at the I-15 numbers, the percentage of carpoolers have roughly stayed the same. It's roughly static over time. I mean, the percentage-wise, right? But as traffic goes up, it's greater numbers of carpool traffic themselves. What I can say is a couple of things. The HOV lanes that we've actually constructed to date on the I-15 corridor and the ones we're working on the South Bay BRT, they serve a purpose beyond just the carpooling because some of the rapid services that we're actually implementing, so I-15 rapid from Escondido, from Rancho Bernardo, and sort of points along the I-15 corridor, that has served as a way to keep the buses on schedule and provide really direct access.
Makes the mass transit that use those vehicles,
Yes.
those lanes, much more attractive.
Yes, and then what we've been able to do too is use the capacity that's created by those lanes for sort of to the fullest without compromising. So like on Interstate 15, we have our fast track program, which has been in existence since about more than about 2 decades now. We first started the pilot program back in 1996. So the HOV lanes have priority for carpools, van pools, and public transit. And any excess capacity we sell off to single drivers, and they pay a fee to use those lanes. And that fee gets reinvested both in operation of the facility itself, which provides funds to Caltrans to operate the facility, and goes back into public transit in that corridor. So, if you ask the question, hey, do the lanes themselves create new carpoolers? I couldn't tell you definitively, but it has some other priorities for us. We're supporting the public transit system, and then, just being able to provide more choices for people in that corridor.
How significant is the payment portion of the use of those, where people
pay?
pay?
I don't know the average, I mean, it ranges anywhere from 50 cents to around $4. I haven't driven that corridor.
How much utilization do you get at those rates? The rates go up depending upon the density of the traffic
Yes.
on the other ones.
Yes.
It's a wonderful idea. I'm just curious how many people buy into the program and pay.
I can get you those, I don't have those at the top line.
Can I just
Yes,
answer as a
yes,
user?
yes.
Okay, when traffic is totally congested, the HOV lanes have a huge increase during the traffic, because I drive that I-15
Right.
corridor. And it's amazing, because, usually you can go, like, if you wanted to, 75 miles an hour in the HOV lane. You're down to about 45, which is a heck of a lot better than 3
Right.
miles an hour on the regular. But, I mean, there's a lot of
If
traffic.
you can afford to pay it, it really solves the problem.
Right,
Exactly.
but also remember that the operation of the managed lanes, I mean, the main goal of the operation is to keep as much of a free flow as possible. And the first priority is transit and HOV users. So if traffic is really bad and it's full with HOV users, it transitions from a facility that you have the option to pay into as a single occupant vehicle to an HOV-only facility during that period of time.
Interesting.
How does the driver know that?
It's
I
posted.
Signs.
Where is it
fine.
posted? Wait,
It's on the changeable
me-
message signs.
You gotta pay attention to the sign when
You
you're doing
do.
that.
Or you could be in trouble.
But Carolyn's too busy driving 75 miles.
Yeah, you're right.
When you're trying to manipulate through those lanes, you gotta read all the fine print, whether you're authorized to go in there or not.
What's interesting about the lanes, you think, okay, obviously people are making some rational decisions about their time and money, but folks are, like, in the off-peak, when there's no traffic on I-15, people will still use the lanes. People will still pay to use the lanes for 50 cents, $1, $2. Some of it's the reliability. They said, okay, well, I'm taking my chances if I'm driving I-15, that there still could be an accident, where generally if you're in the express lanes, for a certain period, it's generally free flow. So it's raising funds not just in the peak period where you expect most people to do it, but actually there's folks that use it all throughout the day.
I have a question. I noticed that in the union, you got some fine print with your name.
Okay.
And it said that you were, I guess, commenting that there could be future ballot measures similar to Proposition 1B to raise funds. At what point in time will SANDAG decide that for projects or whatever else, that they've got to start looking about a ballot measure?
Can I answer that? Can I run through this, then we can talk
Oh,
about
I'm
that?
sorry. Okay, no problem.
Yeah. Just to finish this up, because I do
Okay.
talk about kind of what are the next steps or what's on the horizon. Talked a little bit about the matching ratio, looking back, about a 3-to-1 ratio, looking forward. Looking forward. It's about the 3-to-1 ratio. Yeah, it's actually, we just did an op-ed, our chairman did an op-ed in the Voice of San Diego, the exact number is about 3.4-to-1 ratio. That's assuming everything goes forward. I can do that.
No problem.
Yeah, it's just a mouse. These are the same numbers that's shown in the chart here, but just sort of to reflect that. So in terms of funding opportunities, near term, it's not going to be in the first 100 days. They've talked about it now in the second 100 days, but there's still discussion of a major infrastructure investment at the federal level. $1 trillion has been thrown out there. We will need to see sort of details. That $1 trillion is more than just transportation. It could be energy, water, other infrastructure systems in the United States, but that's something we're going to be taking a look at as the new administration is installed. At the state level, late last year, both the chair of the Assembly Transportation Committee and the Senate Transportation Committee introduced new funding measures. They're nearly identical. It's about $6 billion of funding. Governor Brown actually just hot off the press yesterday released his draft budget, and he also does include sort of an infrastructure package. It's a little bit smaller, but it's a 10-year sort of investment of about so annually about 4.3 billion. I don't have the numbers exactly, but similar increases in terms of revenue sources where both, if you look at the legislature and the governor, are looking at increasing or resetting the gas excise tax back to kind of its historical level, and then tying it to some sort of CPI or index moving forward. Increasing the diesel excise tax, some additional funding for cap and trade, and some loan paybacks and whatnot. So at least on the state side, that discussion has been renewed, and in terms of the governor and the legislature, there is some interest in funding transportation infrastructure, with funding going to both the state side of the house as well as the locals and regional areas. So those are perhaps the most near-term future in terms of that. In terms of long-term, really relies on sort of the level that we're able to invest in sort of future federal authorizations. But looking back, right now we're under what's called the FAST Act, which is the latest long-term federal transportation authorization. And the FAST Act did do a significant increase in investment compared to similar levels in MAP 21, which was the prior year. So over time, when we start taking a look at that as a future funding opportunity, over the long term, as with the fuel efficiency of vehicles and sort of attention on climate change and greenhouse gas emissions reductions, areas like California, Oregon, Washington are studying or have studied actually changing the user fee framework for transportation. Right now relies largely on gasoline excise tax and diesel excise tax. But the road user charge pilot that's underway, study that's underway in California is going to help inform that. But really it's be transitioning things from a per gallon gas tax to a per mile charge, especially as you get as more fuel efficient vehicles or electric vehicles that don't use fuel. So in California right now, the study really looks at what they would need to do per VMT tax, just replace with the existing structure. So it doesn't necessarily include additional revenue, like a higher revenue rate per VMT, but obviously that, if that mechanism is eventually adopted, that's one way that may be taking a look at in terms of VMT charges in addition to just your standard terms of excise charges.
Kim, is there a sense that there's a growing concern and acceptance of this concept of the VMT nationwide, or is this still we don't increase any taxes any place, anytime, anywhere?
I think there's a recognition that something needs to be done. So I think intellectually there's a recognition something needs to be done because other governmental policies, right, in terms of clean fuels, more efficient vehicles, people are still riding the roads. There's still wear and tear to the roads itself, and so there's a recognition that something needs to be done. I don't think there's a
sort of a no-brainer. It's amazing that there hasn't been more traction on the subject to date.
But I mean, even something as I think when people would think a no-brainer, just indexing the gas taxes. There hasn't been a lot of appetite both at the state and federal level.
And that falls in the category don't increase taxes.
Yes. But people can understand the concept of inflation, or that your buying power. We haven't changed the rates for years. So your buying power over time is not.
Independent of that, your mileage per gallon it's doubled, so your taxes are falling in half effectively based on your usage.
I mean, in terms of the, I think there are also other forces. There's concerns with any sort of new structure. So the gas tax, people you pay at the pump. It's easily collected. Some of it, what the pilot program is looking at, is like, how can you efficiently collect fees like this? There's also concerns about privacy, right? People were given a couple different ways to actually participate. You can do it more from a paper or sort of old school way of doing it, and you can do stuff where it does a little bit more tracking and stuff. So I know some of the privacy impacts of your mileage being tracked is also something that needs to get studied.
I was just curious, when you're in the realm of how the world is changing and the implications for, in this case, revenue collection, I was also thinking do you guys think at all in terms of how the world is changing and the implications for example, congestion mitigation, given we're looking at the next 30 years, one can imagine that there could be significant impacts of smarter cars and driverless technology on, the pace of traffic and the more efficient use of the existing infrastructure. And I'm wondering if you guys kind of think about that at all, or if there's any way that you blend those kinds of thoughts into the planning process.
Well, Wasn't this the argument that the opposition to the ordinance really played upon? That
It actually came up at the UT. The UT's editorial on Measure A raised the concept that, you know, with the advent of autonomous vehicles or advanced technologies, that you would not need, you know, necessarily.
Well, it's all in the realm of who knows, but yeah, I guess, again, given, you know, when you think 30 years out, some of those kinds of considerations may come into play, and I'm just curious as to if there's any way that you know, try to think about those types of things in the planning process.
Yeah, in the long-term planning process, I think with San Diego for the regional plan, there was recognition that advanced technologies are going to have the potential to change or disrupt what we know right now. In terms of a practical thing, I mean, so some of the things with advanced technology, for example, with the cars being able to either talk to infrastructure or talk to one another, the vehicle-to-vehicle technology, there's been a lot of discussion, a lot of study on, and we actually did something 20 years ago with an automated highway test, where you actually are able, automated vehicles in theory can travel more closely together. Right. So your average lanes we talked about with, you know, Interstate 15, your average, or anywhere, your average lane that carries 2,000 vehicles, you know, does that double the capacity of those lanes, or what? And so, can you use your existing infrastructure more efficiently? So yes, I think there's recognition that we need to study that. It's like forecast. It's hard to sort of assume. I don't think, because if we assumed that all our lanes would carry double the capacity, we haven't done that. You know, we haven't done our models where we've implemented those assumptions. But we're taking a look, and I think our next update in the RTP is really going to have to take a look at what opportunities for autonomous vehicles, what does that do in terms of the capital program. I can say over time, if you look at even if you look at the policy with electric vehicles, alternative fuel vehicles, California probably has one of the I guess most progressive and aggressive way of wanting to introduce those vehicles into the market. Well, those aren't going to change overnight. I mean, even in California, I think the percentage of penetration is in the low, you know, single digits in terms of overall all the fleet mix in California. So at any given time, I think there's going to have to be some transition period, because even as these vehicles get introduced, the fleet's not going to change overnight. And so I think there will be some time at least to, you know, with updates of the plan and us doing some additional studies and looking forward and how we incorporate that. You know, Dick, you talked a little bit about the HOV managed lanes and whether we're sort of supporting carpools. Well, the one thing I do see sort of long term, if we can build what's in the plan in terms of an HOV managed lane, a network, it could also serve as sort of a way for us to both test or operate autonomous vehicles as you're in that period of transition. That's always been something sort of in the back of our minds, you know, looking back 20 years when you first did those initial pilots with autonomous vehicles and platooning. But it's on our radar screen in terms of has it been fully incorporated into the plans in terms of our traffic forecasts? I'd say not necessarily.
It becomes a real challenge to convince all those drivers that are stuck in traffic on 805 and say, don't worry, the driverless car will solve all your problems, just hold your breath.
Well, when you think about the magnitude of dollars spent on infrastructure, for a lot of which is for congestion mitigation, I mean, conceptually, there's the question of, do you spend the money building extra lanes, or, for example, do you spend the money paying every car owner X thousand dollars to upgrade to a driverless car?
Right.
I mean,
I'm sorry. As long as this is on the subject, am I remembering this right, that Caltrans had a pilot program on I-15, which is now part of the managed lanes? For how far did that extend?
The pilot program, which one are you talking about?
No, yeah, I mean, where they tested the driverless cars, but was it like for 1 mile, 2 miles?
It was 8 miles. So it was the original express lanes facility that was from like the 163 I-15 merge up to 56. It was the 2-lane reversible facility that was in place at the time. So 1995, 96, the automated highway system experiment was done on that because it was barrier separated. So it's sort of a safe way of of doing that test. That was 20 years ago.
So
Yeah.
see, I don't know enough about it, but is the infrastructure that had to do all the sensing, is it still exists? There used to be a little building off on the side of the highway that was used for that, but I don't know anything about it subsequently.
We can find out. My understanding was that original tests were done with more like magnets in the pavement. And so
There was different technologies,
Yes.
and one of the technologies was magnets in the pavement,
Yeah.
which is now an ancient technology.
Oh,
It's not
okay.
needed any longer. Other technologies are technologies that are being proposed, say, radar, like things you can actually buy on cars today.
Oh, I see.
And so, but yeah, those magnets in the pavement, I believe, are all gone. If not, there's, that's not either. That's
Okay,
not a-
sorry, I didn't know what it was.
And so, last but not least, sort of new revenues, the discussion, I mean, our board at their annual retreat in February are gonna be sort of looking at the results of Measure A and kind of the outcomes. We have been, the registrar did release sort of their files in terms of the election results, so we have taken a look at that. So, region-wide, overall, the folks supporting Measure A came in at about 58%. Yeah.
Better than the Chargers.
Low bar there. So, yeah, 58%. I mean, and so obviously you can look at glass half full, glass, half empty. If you look at glass half full, it was 58% of voters wanted some or felt that investment in infrastructure was a good idea. That was in spite that we did receive opposition both from both parties, so at both ends, as well as in UT. We didn't, right near the end there, did not get a good. They did not come up. They did not support it. We also had the mayor of San Diego who did not support it. So there was a lot of sort of headwinds, as you say, against Measure A. But so having the fact that 58%, looking kind of more geographically at the numbers, there's definitely areas that where the 2/3 threshold did pass. I mean, a lot of the, I would say, the urbanized areas, portions of Chula Vista, National City, City of San Diego, and the heart of the mid-city along the 515 and 94 corridor is sort of the heart of the City of San Diego. But real small pockets sort of all around the county and stuff that supported it, but not to meet the threshold. Board members obviously were disappointed, I think, in the outcome, and some of them are looking. A lot of it, we're going to have to digest some of the results and see where folks are. Some of them are looking at. There's even discussion. Actually, MTS has it on their agenda today. Are there appetites to do some sort of things on a smaller scale, not a regional scale, but a sub-regional scale? So I know some of the MTS board members have talked about could MTS put something on it. Their executive committee, who's tomorrow, their executive committee's meeting tomorrow and considering that. I know our board members in North County have talked about, could they do something smaller up in their area, focused on improving the 78 corridor, or at least the local elected officials in that area are sort of united about on the need to improve the 78 corridor, including the connections with interstate. So, in terms of what's the appetite, it really sort of depends. I think we're gonna have some discussions, or the leadership's gonna be having some discussions over the next several months with regard to that. A lot of it, I think, we're just about to embark on our next update of the regional transportation plan. So I'm thinking that our thinking is the dialogue and that discussion at a community level and stakeholder level will hopefully come out as part of that regional plan to see is there an appetite to move forward with some additional funding measure. So.
Kim, is there any feasibility to, don't be labor disputes, but take the 805 and the 5 problems that we experience out there now, is if there was physical capacity to privatize one pay lane? Has that ever been tried? Is that economically viable at all?
I don't think we've studied, taking one lane and
No, creating a new lane.
Oh, creating a new lane.
Creating a new lane, but finance it privately.
Right.
I mean, it seems to me if I'm one of those drivers and I'm sitting there for an hour every day, I'm thinking about how much would I pay?
Right.
Exactly.
If there was a lane that strictly as a pay-to-play lane, and use the private sector since you can't get any government funding to do it.
I don't believe we've done that study. We haven't looked at it at that level. because it's always has been, it's part of the long-range planning, part of transit and everything, but no, we have not.
Do you know, has it been done any place where there's a sort of a shared approach where you have public roads and you have an adjacent private road to alleviate the congestion, but you pay to play?
Yeah, I mean, well, the
91?
Yeah, the 91 is probably the
The 91 is probably the closest thing.
But it's a full pay to play, it's not.
Right.
Yeah. No, the 91 are actually express lanes in the median of Interstate 91. So I forget, a while ago, the state did pass the sort of public-private partnership test.
I think at 125.
Yeah, so
No,
120, there were four, it allowed for three or four, I think, areas where we could test this. 94 was the first one. It was built by private sector. Eventually it's passed, it's now owned by Orange County Transportation Authority. 125 was the other one. So 125 was a full just toll road on this, sort of greenfield development. 94 was probably the closest thing that came to that.
125 was not a successful experiment.
Well, it opened when the recession started, so.
Yeah, that chart.
And 94, in terms of if you look at it, continued in private ownership, that also transitioned to public ownership. The issue with that was there was some non-compete clauses that I think ultimately folks weren't supportive of, right? Because obviously if you need to preserve some sort of traffic and revenue for folks investing in the lanes, those folks did not want the public sector to widen lanes that would take traffic away. So it's been done, it just not recently. Yeah.
It's intriguing when we wrestle with the inability to see adequate funding coming in the future. Yet
Right.
those people, I'm not one of them. I have
Right.
to unfortunately go the opposite direction, but I just see those people on 805 every day. Boggles my mind how they put up with that.
Me too.
So in terms of next steps, the revenue estimates are coming back to you, our mid-year, actually next month, as we normally planned. And, Ray kind of showed you where we are on some of the numbers and stuff, so we do anticipate a lower projection kind of moving forward. The plan of finance we'll be working on, we've been sort of focused on getting the TIFIA loan underway, but we do anticipate bringing that to you in the next quarter or so. And then as Ray mentioned, San Diego as a whole is focused on the next update of the regional growth forecast, which includes kind of this rebuild of our forecasting models and structures. And so that'll be coming over the course of the next year, because that really lays the groundwork for the next update of our RTP that you guys also are involved in. So that's where we are.
Kim, just two questions. One, just to finish up on that, is there a 10-year comprehensive plan with Sandag? Is that what's going to happen as well?
Yes, that's another thing that's coming up. Fiscal 18?
Right, so that's scheduled to begin in next fiscal year, so we're kicking that off in July.
And what's that related to compared to the RTP and all the other different, plans you have to plan a finance? What's the difference between the 10-year comprehensive?
So the 10-year is going to occur in FY18, and it will align, it'll feed into the RTP, so the information into the RTP, the next update of the RTP. So, yeah, I mean, the purpose of it is to look at the expenditure plan and see if there are any changes that
And the
need
last
to
time
be
that was
made.
done was 8 years ago?
No, we haven't. This would be the first one.
Oh.
Yeah, the original transit extension did not have that language in, or the original transit measure, so the transit extension incorporated that. And I know when the ordinance was first being developed, the extension ordinance was being developed, a lot of it was with the recognition that, hey, you can't, what we're deciding or contemplating in early 2000s, the world may change between then and 2048, to actually have these regular kind of check-ins on, is everything okay? Do we still need these, does it still make sense for this group of projects, for these investments, this sort of track? So this would be the first time that the agency has done that.
And the last question I had related to sort of the shortfall that we've been talking about, because I know you're talking about the regional corridors and the impacts there, but what about, this is all formula-based, but
Right.
the local streets and roads, transit, and then the environmental mitigation aspects of it, and how is that all impacted financially with the less revenue coming in on that? Cities are going to get less money. Does it just flow down and the cities have to just bear the brunt with all that? And then on the environmental mitigation efforts, what about all that? Is that getting shortchanged? related to all that? How's that all work? If there's less money coming in, and you planned a certain amount of money to go to environmental mitigation and all these other active programs and all the grant programs and all that, how's that work?
I mean, yes, if there's less money comes in, less money goes, if more money comes in, more money goes.
I would take you back to that first slide that Ray had, where it goes up and it goes down. So one of the things that we tried to do, and you'll be seeing that in February, is the short-term revenue forecast. So that's a 5-year look ahead, which tends to be much closer to where we're going to be, and that helps both the local transit agencies, everyone essentially, to figure out, okay, where is it that we're headed, and have a higher level of confidence that, yeah, you know, things may change a little bit, but they probably won't change, by, a lot.
Yeah.
So that's part of the information that we share just to help them plan.
And that would likely impact what kind of money they're going to hold for projects and not spend down. I mean, who knows what the current projects they have in line they're going to use transit money for with less money coming in. Do they hold the money longer for those projects? And
right.
I guess things like that.
Yeah, and we've done, like in the past when we hit the recession and revenues were coming in lower than we had anticipated, we did let transit agencies, local agencies, everybody know, hey, things are coming in lower than anticipated. You need to make provisions in your plans because the amount that we can pay out is limited by what we're collecting.
Yeah, I mean, a little bit it's different. I don't think that local agencies necessarily do a 40-year lookout or lookout through the thing. Their CIPs are 2 to 5 year CIP, so I don't think they don't count that money when they make. And then in terms of the grants we do every 2 years, so we always have exactly how much funds are out there. And in terms of the transit side, same thing. It's the operators are usually even more conservative than we are.
Yeah.
So you're just not getting, is Sandag staff getting any pressure or comments from agencies concerned? I mean, I know the press coverage is more on the bigger projects and Sandag in general, but I'm just curious what if agencies are calling you and say, hey, look, we're concerned or anything like that. But
I would say that it tends to be, their focus tends to be more on the short term because, their budgets are, 2, maybe 4 years into the future.
Thank you. Thanks, Ken.
Just if I could go back just a second, at the beginning of the conversation, Ray, when you were going through the forecasting model, you're really talking about the Transnet funds forecasting and the inputs, and we talked about the concept of risk and confidence levels.
Right.
One thing that is a little unaccounted for, it almost seems as if this perhaps the single biggest assumption or area of risk is the multiplier of the external funds ratio to the Transnet funds. And because it can't simply be a dependent variable, right? I mean, it's not like a plug. It's a real world kind of thing. Either you can or you can. So I guess I'm curious as to, from a confidence level standpoint, do you have any ability to assess whether the variance in that multiplier is kind of like it's going to be the difference of 3.3 versus 3.4 as opposed to 3.4 versus 2.9? I mean, is there any way to try to assess the risk around that multiplier? If you understand what I'm asking.
We could certainly run different scenarios to try to see what the overall impact would be of different match rates. We haven't done that.
Or I guess maybe another way to ask the question is, within that multiplier of match rates, are there certain sources that are more highly predictable than others? So you could start parsing a confidence level around how much of that match rate do you have a very high confidence level, and how much is a little bit more unknown, or do you know what I mean?
I understand the question. I don't have enough background in how we've done it in the past. Jose, do we have information on that?
Yeah, I mean, if you look at the past 30 years, I mean, the variety of sources that have come in has changed. I mean, some sources continue on, some sources disappear and are replaced by others. There are one-time funds. And it's not just the revenues, it's also the relative size of the costs. Costs have also gone up, but they've also gone down. And so during those periods when they've gone down, we try to build as much stuff as possible. So there's a lot of moving parts. You can look at those fund sources that are much more, have a much longer history, if you will, and try to determine, okay, how has that grown? But for example, when voters, approved the Transnet extension back in 2004, no one had any idea that Proposition 1B was going to be approved by the voters just 2 years later, and that added almost $20 billion just within the state for transportation. And that came in at a very opportune time, because just as Transnet revenues were going down, we were getting more dollars from the state, and costs were also going down, so we were able to buy more stuff. So yes, you can do some of that, but as Ray said earlier, it's really difficult when you've got so many different moving parts, and some of them changing up and down quite significantly. To do that.
Most of which are tied to political issues, which makes it even more difficult.
Well, I was just really raising in your other end the point that you sort of started, which is that the Transnet portion of this is the smallest piece, and so the risk in that match rate is in some respects the biggest risk in the whole forecast.
And so, looking back, I mean, even through all of these changes in terms of which revenues have actually been available to pay for things. So what we look sort of, taking a step back, looking at the bigger picture, is that in the past 30 years or so, the amount of matching funds has been on about a 3-to-1, 3 matching versus 1 Transnet dollar, even with all of those, variances and fluctuations and changes and all of that.
Great. Yep. Okay, thank you. Any other questions? It's been immensely informative. Really appreciate it. Thanks so much. So the last item is just to point out that we're looking at Wednesday, February 8th for our next meeting. People have known.
I have a question related to the board retreat. I talked to Ariana the other day. I'm just curious because some of us might be interested in going on the board retreat, which overlaps a tad, maybe on the 9th or 8th. So I just was curious.
Oh yeah, what are the dates on that? That's good.
8th, 9th, and 10th. So it's the afternoon of the 8th, which is the Wednesday day of our thing, and then Thursday, holiday Thursday, and half day Friday.
So when would be the information related to?
I believe it's on Thursday, David.
Thursday?
Yeah.
Dave.
Yeah, I think Wednesday afternoon is scheduled more for an orientation for new board members, is my understanding, for the board retreat. So Wednesday afternoon, more of an orientation.
3 o'clock on Wednesday.
The agenda's not set in stone yet, but.
Brad's asking when the Measure A discussion. That's on Thursday.
Just Measure, but the Measure A and anything else. I mean, I think last few years I've gone, Stuart's gone, and some of you would be interested in going. And it sounds like Thursday, so it doesn't conflict with this.
Just
the new member orientation is late Wednesday,
right.
Measure A discussion Thursday morning.
And then your rest of the board agenda Thursday, Friday.
Yeah, I would understand just for the other members of the committee that, the past couple of years when I've gone, particularly to hear the discussion around Measure A and the things that relate to transit, it's really, if you can get up there, it's really, really useful.
Where's the jump?
Is it Verona again?
Yeah, it's Los Angeles.
Just a friendly reminder also, if you could let us know if you are planning on attending. If we run into an issue with the quorum, then we need to post the agenda, or rather publicly notice the meeting that I talked about, if we have more than 4 members attending, so.
Just invite some of us.
So just let me know, and we'll take care of it, but we just need to know how many people are going.
Gathering.
So that's
what happens if we all go out to a Padres game?
You can't. Okay, did you ask if we could come?
Does anybody know if they have problems with the 8th? Or we can just
I'll be here.
Good. Great. Then I think we're adjourned.
You, of course, are losing your